Welcome to the Borders and Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples in the Salish Sea region. And today we are pleased to welcome Patrick Lozar, assistant professor in history at the University of Victoria. He works particularly on the native nations of the Upper Columbia River region and their experiences with the Canada-United States border. So our interview today focuses on the relationship between Indigenous peoples and international borders. Welcome, Patrick Lozar.
Thank you, Benjamin, for inviting me and having me on the show. I'm pleased to be here and to share.
Thank you. But before we begin, Professor Lozar, can you briefly share with our audience your academic profile and your research interests?
Yeah, sure, of course. Well, first of all, it's important for me to mention the connection between my personal background and my professional work in history. I'm a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Indian Reservation in western Montana, and that background with my family and my community has informed my research in the study of history. And so I went to graduate school, got my PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle to study parts of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes history, and specifically the Kootenai band's history and the relationship with Kootenai bands to Naha bands in British Columbia and Idaho. So my work really is informed by my community ties and my family ties back home at the reservation. But my research broadly is on Indigenous histories in North America and borderlands in the Pacific Northwest, specifically the interior Pacific Northwest, and the ways that Indigenous communities have had to deal with the Canada-United States border that has been drawn through their operational territories since 1846. And so I'm working on a book project at the moment, and on this topic. It comes out of my doctoral dissertation. And I get to teach classes at the University of Victoria on Indigenous histories in North America. So it's a bit about my academic profile. I've been at UVic since 2019, and it's been great so far.
Thank you, Patrick Lozar, for this biography. Very interesting. My first question concerns what you call ethno-history methods and de-colonizing indigenous geographies. What does it consist of? And why is this useful for our topic of discussion today?
Yeah, I mean, ethnohistory is, in broad terms, the kind of the marriage of history and anthropology, or anthropological methods, or ethnography, and all the associated fields of archaeology, linguistics that go into the study of Indigenous peoples in all over the world. A lot of it actually began in North America with this kind of recognition that anthropology studies culture and history studies the past. How do we understand cultures in the past? And so being able to recognize the continuities and changes in Indigenous culture over time is kind of the broad entry point to ethnohistorical methods. And so it's really important for being able to understand how communities operate historically, and how they relate to the land and what that cultural tie to their homelands looks like. And so approaching sources that are archive based, that come from Western sources of colonial governments and that are now housed in repositories and archives, and approaching those documents with kind of an ethnohistorical eye, along with recognizing the oral traditions of Indigenous communities that pass down their cultural knowledge over time through oral traditions, oral histories to articulate their past and why they exist where they do in North America. And so being able to recognize those methods and what they can do for telling these histories in more recent years that allow us to get at some of these questions about place and about belonging and about relationships and communities, and to kind of break down some of the colonial traditions of the archive that has been so divisive and so controlling over Indigenous history, and to recognize in many ways that these same documents from colonial archives are actually can be used as foundational documents to tell a border story of an Indigenous communities that was never really intended to be as such. There are just many snippets in Canada's archives in Ottawa or the United States archives in Washington, D.C. that do reference continuities of Indigenous community activity across the border, even though they didn't want, cross-border activity, but they're talking about it in these letters and correspondence and reports, and so it's there. And to be able to put them all together shows a border story that is often missed in colonial archives.
Thank you for this answer and for all of these clarifications. Very interesting. Patrick, my new question is about the Pacifique Northwest region. What are the main characteristics of the Pacific regions in terms of indigenous peoples and borders? You have spoken about that in the first question, but what is the history of this region when you connect the subject of borders and the subject of indigenous people?
Yeah, I guess I'd start by saying, the border between British North America or Canada and the United States came about in 1846. There are oral traditions of interior Salish communities, Tanaha communities who indicate that they've been here since time immemorial. An archaeological record that shows that peoples have been here since 13,000 years ago. So there's a pretty big difference between 13,000 years and the year 1846, which is about coming up on 200 years old. So it's much deeper. The border is brand new in the grand scheme of things. So just to clarify that, but the indigenous history of the region, there's some similarities in the BC part of the Northwest and the Washington, Idaho, Montana part in terms of the way that indigenous communities experienced colonization, whether it's through mining rushes or the establishment of reserves and reservations, and the treaty or lack of treaty history between First Nations in Canada and Native American tribes in the United States. And the Northwest region has some of these features and has also some unique features to itself compared to the rest of North America. But the border, the 49th parallel, really came about with the scratch of a pen in 1846 with the Oregon Treaty. But that's one thing to say on a document that there's a border here, when on the ground it took a long time for it to actually appear. And so if that happened in 46, that you don't see enforcement of the border until World War I or afterwards in the 19-teens. And so it takes a while for it to become an actual thing. But that doesn't mean that if there wasn't a border patrol station or an inspection station or a checkpoint on a main thoroughfare in a valley between the Cascades and the Rocky Mountains, that the border didn't become a thing it was reinforced by other means, by establishing reservations for Native American tribes to go to and remain on, or establishing reserves in British Columbia for the same purpose, and in creating those exclusive spaces onto which Indigenous peoples were supposed to stay on. In a way, the border was indirectly being enforced. And so that was happening all through the late 1800s and going into the 1900s. And so in some ways, it was a very porous border in terms of travel and movement, the continuity of seasonal migrations for hunting and fishing, or gathering berries and roots in the mountains and the valleys of the Northwest. And I'm talking more specifically about the interior Northwest. On the coast, there's many different dynamics that are pretty unique to this this area that I'm in Victoria. And so it takes different domestic and state and provincial laws to get Indigenous peoples to quit crossing the border and to quit hunting on one side of the line or the other. And so it came about pretty incrementally. But through it all, it's colonial violence that and systemic violence that is kind of reinforcing the border before you even get to the 49th parallel line itself. So it's both a borderland and it's a bordered land in some ways at the same time.
Thank you, Patrick Lozar, for this informations. Moving on the next question, if you don't mind, let's talk about the effect of the border on the indigenous communities of this region. What were their reactions facing the construction of this international border between Canada and United States? What does the Pacifique Northwest region could tell us about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. They kind of alluded to all the border activity and maintenance and regulation and enforcement that's happening by the Canadian government and the United States government. It is happening on an incremental basis. So Indigenous communities, the Syilx Okanagan, the Sinixt Nation, the Tanakha Nation in the interior, they're kind of running into this invisible boundary line in according to different situations, different moments of enforcement. And so their responses are quite diverse. The responses range from, basically telling local law enforcement, we don't recognize your border because it's brand new. It's something that is all of a sudden imposed in our territory, and we're going to continue doing the things that we've done. Or I recognize if I cross the border, I can get something, I can buy something for cheaper down in the United States, and then come back up to Canada and consume. And the Canadian government saying, no, you are not allowed to do that. That's going out of Canadian jurisdiction. And people saying, too bad, basically. And so there were moments of trying to reinforce in the minds of people near the line, who are frequent crossers of that invisible line, to recognize and respect it, right? And that happened, only on an incremental basis, and it was an unfinished process for the longest time in the late 19th century and going into the 20th century. There was a good deal of taking advantage of the border's division of national jurisdiction for a number of different purposes, whether that's collecting annuities that were guaranteed by either government on either side of the line, or to just go and be with community members in the northern part of their territory or the southern part of their territory, going down to cultural celebrations, to go and work together in as the wage labor economy became a reality for Indigenous community members and families, and to basically be with each other in a social basis. And they would, kind of act as if the border wasn't a meaningful thing in their lives, but then they also reacted by recognizing that a reservation or a reserve could be the last remaining exclusive territory in their government-to-government relationship with the federal government that they could actually exert their sovereignty over. And so those reserves and reservations became that much more important, and it was bound up with identity. Identity being related to a tribe in the United States or a band in Canada. And so there is a political kind of reorienting by groups now that have now found themselves on either side of the line or not. And so there's kind of a doubling down on this new political identity that either Canada recognizes or the United States recognizes, and to make that new identity, that new kind of government structure on a reservation or a reserve work for them. And so in that way, the reaction is a recognition that the border represents that this is either the United States or this is Canada, and we have to work with Ottawa or Washington, D.C. to make the most of this situation in a colonial sense. And certainly that's happening by the turn of the century in the 1910s to the 1930s.
Thank you, Patrick Lozar. I would like now to talk about a recent court decision. In 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada rendered a very interesting decision on the relationship between borders and the Indigenous peoples existing on both sides of the border. This is the R.V. de Sautel case between the Queen and Richard Lee de Sautel. This judgment was rendered on April 23, 2021. We see that history and historical evidence are very important elements in terms of the rights of Indigenous peoples. What could be the implication of this decision, the Sautel decision, in terms of Indigenous people lives in the borderlands, and also in terms of protection of their ancestral rights and also ancestral territories?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I'll kind of use it to address one part of the other question you asked about, what can the Pacific Northwest or the Upper Columbia River region tell us about border issues? And I think that this R.V. de Sautel case is really important for showing what is happening out here and how that's going to have an effect on the rest of the Canada-United States border from the Yukon to the Bay of Fundy. And so to give a little background on the case, the Sinixt Nation, who in the 19th century saw, most of their territory was actually in British Columbia on the Columbia River in the Arrow Lakes region. They're also called the Arrow Lakes people. And over the 19th century and into the 20th century, due to a number of different push and pull factors, found their families and bands drifting further and further into the Washington state side of the border, and many remained there for much of the early 20th century. But for the first half of the century, there were still bands in British Columbia, and they only later were assigned to a reserve in BC on the Arrow Lakes by 1902. By the year 1953, Canada is accounting all of the band members for the Arrow Lakes Band in British Columbia and recognizing that the last remaining band member on the list has passed away. And so Canada, by the stroke of a pen, says the Arrow Lakes Band of the Sinixt Nation in Canada is extinct, which is a pretty bold statement to make, to say that a people are extinct. Many had drifted to Tanaha bands and Okanagan bands, or Salix Okanagan bands in British Columbia. And I'd say probably the majority went to the Colville Indian Reservation in Washington State, certainly by the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so British Columbia says there are no Sinixt in Canada or in British Columbia, and so it would seem the story ends there. But by the 1980s, you see more and more Sinixt people from Washington State returning to their northern territories at the request of their elders, saying that is our territory, and we actually have not only ancestral ties to the place, but our ancestors are up there, and we need to reassert our presence and reoccupy our northern territories in kind of the Valakin, Castlegar, Arrow Lake, Slocan Lake area part of British Columbia. And so for the past 30 years, certainly since the 1980s, there have been attempts to get the official recognition of the Sinixt in Canada to proceed. And there's been different ways that's been done in terms of strategies, but one has been through the courts. Well, in 2010, Richard Lee Disotell goes and shoots an elk in British Columbia, and then goes and gives himself up to the police. Says, "I'm an American citizen. I'm a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes in Washington, and I don't have a permit, and I'm not a Canadian, and I shot this elk out of season. Arrest me." And he did this to initiate a case to get their hunting rights recognized in Canada. So. As the case goes up through the BC courts, the appellate courts, and eventually makes it to the Supreme Court of Canada, the Supreme Court basically decides or has to make the determination, according to the Constitution, all rights are protected for Aboriginal peoples of Canada. What is an Aboriginal people? Who are Aboriginal people of Canada? They determine through, as you kind of suggested with the question, historical documentation shows that they've been around in what is now Canada for way longer than there's ever been a Canada, or the Crown, and the Crown's claims to North America, right? And so the court just determined that in fact they are Aboriginal people of Canada with hunting rights that are preserved. Now, that's a huge victory for the Sinixt Nation, but it's going to be. I mean, it's a year on now, coming up or so, and we're still trying to grapple with the potential after effects of this monumental decision in terms of Native American tribes in the United States who have historical ties to what is now Canada above the line, and what are those rights going to look like. And so I guess I would say that number one, the part about historical documentation. I mean, there was a huge deal of work and research done to substantiate these claims to a long time heritage in British Columbia for the Sinixt people that was difficult to refute despite the province's ability or determination to do so. And so, putting lawyers and historians to work and with historical documents and records, laid that foundation for the case. And then I guess the second part is what's going to happen now. It's hard to say. Don't ever ask a historian to predict the future, Ben.
Okay.
We're never good at it, but I can imagine. I can imagine. Native American tribes and First Nations coming up with new ways to exert those resource gathering rights in Canada, probably on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you for this overview of this amazing decision, the Disotell decision from 2021. Throughout this interview, we have seen that borders are legal constructions that can be bypassed by other legal realities. My last question is this one. Can we reconstruct or deconstruct these borders. In light of the consolidation of the rights of indigenous peoples, can we decolonize the state borders, and how?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's very present today, and has been really in the past generation. And it goes back to a couple of things that are happening at the same time. And one of them is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was established in 2007, and Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that was, the final report was in 2015. So these two kind of major developments in recognition of the state's need to better address First Nations and Indigenous issues are kind of coming together in interesting ways, and they're coming together into border discussions. When it seems oftentimes that, as Canada adopts the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP is the acronym, that's a Canada thing, or when the United States adopts it, it's a US thing. But there's implications for border issues, even though it's a domestically embraced declaration. And so in one of the articles of the several different articles in UNDRIP, it says that states should support and facilitate Indigenous peoples' ability to maintain relationships to each other across international borders or state borders, and to facilitate and support the social, economic, political, social cultural relations, across the line. And so that is in UNDRIP, and Canada and British Columbia have both embraced UNDRIP. So there's a foundation to allow for that to happen. At the same time, in Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the 94 calls to action, one of the calls to action is to begin to compel Canadians to kind of dismantle this thing called the doctrine of discovery. And it's the doctrine of discovery that has allowed the Crown and the United States to claim Aboriginal territory in North America without asking for permission from Indigenous peoples. They see Indigenous peoples as just mere occupants of the land. And so when the Oregon Treaty of 1846 defines the border and makes claims to this part of North America, Indigenous space that was unceded, it's justified through the doctrine of discovery. So UNDRIP is saying support Indigenous peoples across borders, and the TRC is saying let's dismantle the doctrine of discovery, which is the foundation of the border out here. So both of those things are in policy dialogues, or they should be more and more. And Indigenous communities themselves who've been saying this, for the past half century, this border is a fiction to us, and it has been for a long time. And we seek the support to continue to cross the border for either social purposes or ceremonial purposes, or to reconnect to the land on either side of the border, and how that can be done with government support, and to better educate CBSA, the Canadian Border Services, and the U.S. and Customs and Border Patrol on Indigenous border rights and crossing issues, and to be more sensitive and supportive of that unique border experience for Indigenous people that's different from all other North Americans or immigrants to North America who face the border in a different way. It's still pretty fresh and new. So I think those kind of policy things are going to be is what's happening towards decolonization in a more material sense.
Professor Lozar, thank you very much. Do you want to add something to share with our audience about this topic of today, the relationship between indigenous people, First Nation or tribes, and the borders and the borderlands? What could be your last message from the people who are listening us?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess I would say that there's to speak to the resilience of Indigenous communities as they pursue greater autonomy and sovereignty across borders and developing and maintaining relationships across borders, especially at a time in COVID, because COVID has been pretty brutal because the border was actually completely shut down, and that shut down in a much more visceral sense in the past 2 years than it had been in previous years, because there was literally no traffic across the line that kind of reinstated or reinvigorated almost some of those divisions and reasserted those divisions, excuse me. And so to kind of recognize the continuity and the resilience of communities to maintain relationships to each other across this border that has been so present in our lives these past several years with the COVID pandemic, and to maybe see as that as a place from which to go despite these boundaries and barriers that kind of flare out at times.
Thank you for your last thought. Very powerful. Patrick Lozar, thank you very much for participating in our podcast series. It was a real fascinating discussion. Thank you again for all these informations, and I enjoyed a lot our conversation. This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Today we were with Patrick Lozar, assistant professor at the University of Victoria. Thank you all for your attention, and see you soon for the next issue. Patrick Lozar, see you soon in Victoria on the campus of Victoria. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Limnich.